Hey guys, Jay Anthony here. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to do a really quick little review of two kind of stalwarts of the entry-level divers watches. Those of you that are passionate about watches and spend a lot of time on watch forums should be very familiar with these two pieces. If you're interested in each model individually, feel free to look through my channel history. I have reviews on both the Orient Mako and the Seiko Monster. For the sake of this video, this is just going to be a brief little comparison. Again, the traditional Orient Mako, this is not the newer Orient Mako XL, this is the traditional Orient Mako, and versus the Seiko Monster SRP 307J1. This is a little bit of a mismatch. I understand that the Mako is a little bit cheaper than the Monster. However, these tend to put people into polarized camps of either liking one more than the other. And then there's folks such as myself that own both of them and like them both for their individual quality. So SKX Monsters versus this Orient Mako would probably be a fairer comparison. However, all that given said, as I have them both available for me right now, why don't we go ahead and take a little look at two great entry-level divers watches and kind of compare and contrast how they are. So to start with, they're both rated at 200 meters. And for whatever reason you didn't know that, you could find that on both their dials, of course. So again, these are both 200 meter water resistant dive watches. That's 660 feet. That's the same depth rating you're going to find on a Rolex Submariner and Omega Seamaster. Most typical dive watches are 200 meter resistance. As you can see, you have two very different takes on dive watches. Both kind of have their own unique spin. Neither one is what you would say a direct ripoff or an homage to a more famous watch. The Orient, there might be a little bit of a notion of, say, Omega in it, but with the Arabic numerals, they've very much kind of done their own thing here. And while it is very much traditional, it's very much a bespoke design to Orient. And same thing with the Monster. You're not going to mistake a Seiko Monster for any other watch. You know, a lot of watches out there, they tend to all be homages of one another. These two are very much distinct players in the market, and they very much have their own sense of style about them. Movement-wise, the Seiko Monster has the 4R36 movement. This is an in-house movement, and it's going to be 24 joules, 21,600 beats per hour. And as you may have noticed, if you're familiar with this watch or on my individual review, it is a hacking and a hand-winding movement. On the other hand, you have the Orient Mako here. The Orient Mako uses an Orient 469 movement. It's my understanding that the 469 movement, which is also a bespoke in-house movement to Orient, actually dates back to a design of a Seiko movement, notably the 6000 movement. So starting with the Orient, you may be wondering why there's actually two different crown guards here. Or not crown guards, but two different crowns. Both of these, by the way, are watertight, so you have to unscrew them both, which is a nice feature. Again, this being a dive watch, it's kind of expected. So the bottom one, as you can see, spins freely. That's because you cannot hand wind it, as I mentioned. And pulling it all the way out, the movement keeps ticking as well, so it's not hacking. It's from this position that you can set the time. You can also rotate the date. It's actually the second guard up here. Those of you that have seen an Omega Seamaster might assume that this is a helium escape valve. It is not. Actually, all it does is it allows you to change the day of the week. So that's what that guy does right there. And if it is true that this actually is in fact based on a 7000 movement Seiko, that would make sense, as those movements actually from the 70s, 80s, I think up until the early 90s even, they did have a day date feature, but they typically had to, you had to push the crown in, I believe, on those to actually change the day of the week on some of them. They had a very different kind of mechanism, so given that Orient's kind of tweaked it in their own way too, it is kind of an interesting way that you actually adjust the day of the week. This is the only watch that I actually know of that does it that way. Whereas the Seiko does it traditionally, where by pulling out the crown, which is also unscrewed. And you'll also notice that the crown on the Seiko is at 4 o'clock versus the traditional 3 o'clock. First position on the Seiko is actually winding. Again, a fair comparison to the Orient Mako would be an SKX model, as those use an older 7S26 movement, and that also would not have been hacking or hand winding, so it would have basically been a similar spec to the Orient, which is also a 21,000-ish beat per hour movement. So the Seiko, again, is hand winding, which the Orient is not. And again, you can adjust both the day of the month, which you can do here, off of the main crown, which is the same as the Orient Mako. They're both quick set dates. But you can also adjust the day of the week on the crown, which Unlike the Orient, you need to use the other crown to adjust that. So a little bit different there. As you can see on the Seiko, they've actually hollowed out parts of the case. And this is actually not only an interesting design feature, but it makes it very easy to turn the bezel. And the diving bezel on this watch is the same as the Orient in terms of its 60 clicks all the way around. It's very easy to grip because of those indentations on the case, and it spins very freely. The Orient is a traditional style case, so there isn't any cutout, and the way they've actually done the indents on the crown, it's actually pretty hard to grip it. When it does actually turn, it is also 60 turns or 60 clicks, and it has a very good quality feel to it, and it actually locks into place very solidly. So you're not going to be worried about being imprecise with its placement. However, it is a lot more difficult to turn than the Seiko's bezel. In terms of dials, they're both very similar in terms of they both mention their 200 meter resistance, and they both mention the name and the fact that they're automatic, go figure. But as you can see, the Orient is much more traditional with typical markers, whereas the Seiko has almost shark fin or shark teeth size markers. And again, even the bezel design on the Seiko is very different. So again, the Orient, you're getting more of a traditional look, and it has Arabic numerals on the dial. The Seiko is very much its own kind of wild design. It's a love it or hate it kind of thing. The Orient would probably appeal to a lot more people because of this. And again, notice that the Orient uses a traditional crown placement at 3, while the Seiko is at 4 o'clock. Case spec wise, the Seiko Monster uses the traditional Seiko case back. It's got a nice raised ocean wave on it, and it's a pretty substantial case back. I actually quite like this design, especially having owned Rolex for as many years, which had just thin blank cases. This is a pretty nice style. It's not as nice as something you'd find on an Omega Seamaster, of course, but it's still pretty nice. The Orient, in contrast, has, I don't know if you can even pick it up on here. There is a design on the case back, but it's like they laser etched it. So it's almost like it's, you can just barely feel it on the back of the case back. So it's nice that they did something, but the Seiko, I would say, certainly has a better case back on it. Both case backs do feel substantial though and well made. Bracelet wise, both of these bracelets, while they are significantly different in style, they both use pushpin links. Screw-out links would be ideal, but given the price point of these watches, it's understood. Retail, the Orient, I believe, is slightly around $325, and retail, the Seiko, is about just under $600 US dollars. If you were to buy them secondhand or on the internet, expect to pay between $90 and $150 for the Orient, and for a K-series Monster, expect to pay about $150 to $180. This one is the J, so this is going to cost you in excess of $200 to just under $300, more than likely online. Bracelet wise, they both use a safety and a deployant. On the Orient, they've called out Orient on the bracelet. There's a little bit of a nice little indent here for good tactile feedback so you can grip it. But the bracelet is very basic. There's no diver's extension. However, the links are solid. They feel pretty nice. And overall, the bracelet's pretty fluid. It's not as smooth as you'd find on a Swiss watch of a substantially higher price point, but it flows well, and it feels nice on the wrist, and it doesn't really yank on your hair, which is nice. You can lock it. The Seiko, on the other hand, is a very much unique design to Seiko. This is not a bracelet you're going to mistake for anything else. Whereas the Orient bracelet is similar to what you'd see on like a Rolex Sub, for example, an oyster style bracelet. The Seiko bracelet is very much a Seiko design, and again, it's something you're either really going to like or you're not. I appreciate it quite a bit. It also, like the Orient, has a safety and a deployant. However, unlike the Orient, this one also has a diver's extension, which is hidden right here. Actually, you have to have it open to do that, don't you? So you got to flick it under, and there you go. There's a diver's extension on the Seiko that you don't get on the Orient. Depending on which source you read, I haven't individually measured it. The Orient is about 41 mil. The Seiko is just under 43 mil. As you can see in person, it's, they easily could pass for the same size. The Orient has a slightly bigger face on it and a slightly smaller bezel, whereas the Seiko has a slightly smaller face and a slightly bigger bezel. So they wear a little bit differently. Again, the Orient has a more traditional case design. The Seiko, it's almost like the bezel kind of sits in this outer surrounding, which is a very unique thing. It's kind of cool. Both of these guys have mineral crystals. So they're not sapphire, they'll take a beating, but they can scratch and they could crack eventually if you hit them on something hard enough. But they should both definitely survive desk diving daily if that's the traditional extent of what most people use these watches for anyway. Just for the record, these watches are available in different colors. The Orient comes in quite a bit of other colors, including orange and black. And the Seiko as well can actually be had in orange. And there's also a combination on a rubber strap with red hands. So if you don't like these particular colors, other ones are available. So the biggest differentiator between these two watches really is going to come down to the movement and the price. One of the things is the Orient has a Japanese movement, but it was not made in Japan, if that's something that matters to you, whereas the Seiko, most of the monsters are also not made in Japan. However, you can get a J series like I have here, which was made in Japan. So if that's something that appeals to you and you have to have a Japanese made watch, you can do that with the Monster. I don't believe that there's a made in Japan version of the Mako. I could be wrong. But again, the biggest difference you're going to find between these two is movement. The Orient movement, the 469, is bulletproof. It's been out for decades, I think over 30 years. Again, it's based on a 70s design Seiko. It's not hacking, it's not winding, but it's extremely reliable, and it's going to give you the same day-date feature as the Seiko. And, you know, I actually kind of think it's kind of cool that they have a separate pusher for the day of the week. I just happen to like that design. The Seiko, again, you're going to get hacking, you're going to get hand winding, and it's based on architecture that's been around for decades. It's a newer movement, however, Seikos in general and the one that came before it, the 7S26, are known for great reliability. So both of these watches should be able to take a beating. And then some. So you really can't go wrong with either choice. If you're strictly concerned with budget, the Orient you can pick up for less money, of course. Style-wise, again, they're very different styles, so they're going to appeal to different people. I like them both, and that's just kind of, I think that they both had their pluses and minuses. So in terms of technological achievement, or I shouldn't say that, but in terms of the movement and just the overall ability of the movement itself, the Seiko's got a better movement in it. In terms of quality and construction, honestly, they're about the same. I don't think either one's is better made or less made or worse made than the other. So you really can't go wrong with either. And I hope this guy has been a helpful little overview of these two great divers watches. And again, I'd highly recommend you pick up either one of them. Thank you so much.